Hi, I'm Brady Daniels, and today I'd like to present AlphaGo and the Hand of God. Well, that title sounds a little sensationalistic, doesn't it? But these were actual words that were used to describe the recent match between an AI and a human master at the game of Go. And my goal with this presentation is to make something that's approachable and enjoyable by Go fans, and something that's approachable and enjoyable by artificial intelligence fans. But even more importantly, I want to make something that's approachable to lay people, people who don't know anything about either Go or artificial intelligence. And as a result, this isn't going to be very technical. And I'll mention neural networks and deep learning, but I won't go into great detail explaining what those mean. Additionally, I'm not going to go through a lot of variations in terms of, and then the computer played here and could have played here and stuff like that. I'm going to try to keep it really simple and just talk about the good stuff. Why don't I start off with a little story? And this occurred in 1846 in Japan. And there was a teenager, and he was a prodigy at the game of Go, and his name was Shusaku. And he was playing an important match with the leader of another house of Go. And this was, if you think about it, this is a teenager playing an old master. And of course the old master is expected to win, and the kids just happen to be here, if you know what I mean. It's an honor to be able to play a Go master. And of course everyone expected the old master to win. But as these stories go, it didn't really turn out that way. So at the beginning of the game, the master got an early lead. Shusaku made a mistake in the lower right-hand corner, and the master was in control. And of course he had a bunch of his disciples there, and they all watched the game and felt the master was in control throughout. But young Shusaku, he kept playing, and he played really well after that initial mistake. And despite the disciples thinking the master was ahead, there was one observer who wasn't a Go player. As a matter of fact, he was a doctor, and he was watching the game, and he said, no, I think maybe Shusaku took the lead. And the disciple said, well, what are you talking about? Why would you think that Shusaku's ahead? You don't even play Go. And the doctor was like, well, no, it's true. I'm not a Go player, but I was watching the master. And when young Shusaku played this stone in the middle of the board, the master's ears turned red. And I think he was uptight, and maybe he felt like he had fallen behind. And indeed, it turned out this doctor had, diagnosed the situation correctly. And this move here in the center of the board is the one he's talking about. And after this, Black took the lead, and Shusaku was able to hold on to that lead and defeat the old master. And this turned out to be a very famous game, and so famous that it was named. And it was forever thereafter known as the Ear Reddening Game. And this move right here is known as the Ear Reddening move. And the funny thing is, if you were to play this sequence out on a board today, and around a gathering of Go people, someone would just walk by, and they'd see the board, and they'd point at it and go, hey, Ear Reddening Game, pretty cool. And this game occurred 170 years ago, yet we still know it today. Well, why am I talking about that when I just said I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence? Well, there's a few reasons. And the first of which is I think that this series that just happened will have a similar significance. And I think that the kids today who watch this game, 10, 12 years old, kids, and they watch these games, when they're old and gray, they're going to be able to put the positions from these 5 games on the board. And someone who's walking by at a gathering of Go players is going to say, AlphaGo, or whoa, Hand of God. I think these games have that kind of significance. Right? So I wanted to give it a little bit of perspective. But the other reason I bring this up is because Go is a game largely about history. And not history just because people want to know history, but because it's a game that no one has ever mastered in one lifetime. And what I mean by that is the players of today are just plain simple better than the players of 2 centuries ago or a century ago or even 50 years ago, because they built up on the knowledge that those other people had, and they've been able to continuously improve the game. But that means that no one has ever mastered it. We just keep improving it. And this idea of, think of it as a generational memory or an institutional memory, becomes really important to this story. So before I jump into these games and the series and explain why AlphaGo and Lee Sedol are so important and why this match matters, let me give a really brief background on Go and the history of computer Go. So the basic rules of Go are very simple, and I can explain them in about a minute. And it's played on a wooden board with a 19 by 19 grid. And there's 2 players. One plays black and one plays white. And they alternate placing stones on this board. And once a stone is played, it's not then moved unless it's captured. And the idea behind the game is quite straightforward. You're trying to surround things. And there's 2 things you can surround. One thing you can surround is open territory. So if you look at this white group here, you can see that it's surrounded this corner. And every vertex within that corner is a point for white at the end of the game. And then the other thing you can surround is opposing groups. And as an example, these 6 white stones are surrounded by black, and they have no way to live. And at the end of the game, they will be removed from the board. So black will get 6 points for the removed stone, and then a point for each vertex where those stones were. So that's it. You can surround territory and you can capture stones. And now you understand the rules. Simple, right? How can this game be hard? Well, before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the history of Go. Where was it created and when? Well, we don't know exactly. We're pretty confident it was invented in China and somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. But because we don't know exactly when and where, that means its origins are clouded in mist, and there's a lot of mythology around the origins. Some people think it's a game that was to teach the generals how to fight wars. Other people have claimed that it was a king who wanted to train his son in the ways of life. But we don't know. This is just mythology. And the Chinese spread the game around Asia, and it became particularly popular in Korea and Japan. And all 3 countries had very strong players. But the next big step forward in Go was when Japan effectively started a professional system. And that happened in the early 17th century when lords sponsored Go players in houses to play Go, where these people would do nothing but learn to play Go, and then they would play for the lord's entertainment and maybe teach the lord as well. And because these people were spending all their time at it, they were able to bring the game forward, and Japan advanced the game of Go. Now, one of the interesting things that we've seen over time is that although there's always been incremental improvement in play, there's occasionally been a player who is so strong that they can introduce entire new concepts to the game and effectively revolutionize it. And unfortunately, that kind of player really only comes around every couple of centuries. But we were lucky enough to have one in the last century. And that kid that I talked about, Shusaku, earlier, he was also considered one of those players and is considered a Go saint. Now, one of the interesting things about having this generational or institutional memory with Go is that other people are able to take advantage. So since the early 1600s up to the mid-20th century, Japan pulled ahead because only they had a professional system. But then, in the second half of the 20th century, both Korea and China started their own professional systems, and it was actually amazing and impressive how quickly they were able to catch up to the Japanese in terms of overall strength. And again, that's because they were able to build up on the strength that the Japanese had built themselves. Once something is known, it's known, and anyone can use that fact. But the fact that Korea and China were able to catch up is actually one of the things that brings us one of the protagonists of our story. And the man in the upper right of your screen is Lee Sedol, and he's an international master of Go. And he's actually won 18 international championships. So to put that in perspective, if you think of it, it's kind of like tennis or golf and winning a major there. And if you can win 18 championships, you're really, really good. And this was the chosen opponent for AlphaGo. So why is Go so hard? And not just for humans, but for computers too? Well, it's because there's so many possible moves. If you look at an empty board, it's played on a 19 by 19 grid, and black can play anywhere he likes. So that leads to nearly 400 moves for the first. All right, well, you can get your head around 400 moves, but I created a little spreadsheet to try to show how quickly the number of possible moves explode over as you add additional moves. Now, there are going to be mathematical pedants and some Go players who are going to look at this and say, the spreadsheet isn't accurate. And indeed, that's correct. For example, on the first move, I haven't reflected the fact that you can turn the board around and reflect, rotate. And so mathematically, there aren't 381 possible moves. I agree, but it doesn't really matter. The point of this spreadsheet is to show the exploding number of possible moves. So on the first move, you have a choice of nearly 400. And the second move, it's the same. You have a choice of 380. But that means already there's 145,000 possible moves. And it continues. After the third move, you have a choice of 379 possible moves, and you're quickly up to 5 million. And then very quickly into the billions of possible moves. And you can see how not only would it be impossible for a human to look at every possible move, it very quickly gets to a point where it's impossible for computers. And your typical game of Go lasts between 150 and 250 moves, but I ended the spreadsheet at 32. Why is that? Well, it turns out that the number of atoms in the known universe is 10 to the 80th. And if you look here at 32 moves, we're beyond 10 to the 80th. So just looking 30-ish moves ahead, there's more possible moves than there are atoms in the universe. And you see why no one can brute force the solution to Go. And this is what brings us into computer Go. The pioneers of computer Go understood the problem with the total number of moves, and their computers then were nowhere near as powerful as today. But even if they had today's computers, they would have realized you can't brute force it, you can't calculate every move. And so the approach they took was to use what we call domain knowledge. And the idea is this: the people who programmed it happened to be really good Go players. And what they did is they programmed in as well as they could how they think. And so they would program in concepts like, don't let yourself get surrounded, so move out if you're getting surrounded. Or if you've got two walls of stones lined up and you can bend ahead, you should try to do that. So they would program in these simple principles. And actually, considering the bluntness of the approach, it's amazing how well they did. It really was quite impressive. But nevertheless, in the real world, the results weren't that great. For example, it didn't take very long after I learned Go that I was able to beat the strongest of these computers that there were. Yay, I felt so strong I could beat a computer. But obviously it turned out that wasn't that big an accomplishment. So, good job on these first computers, but they weren't that strong. And this led to the second generation. So in 2006, programmers began applying the concept of Monte Carlo tree search to Go. And the idea is this: you can't look at every possible move, but using the knowledge of the programmers, you could tell a computer where to look, what are some likely successful moves, and the computer could go ahead using those likely moves and simulate a whole bunch of games and keep going down one step further. And by simulating what the games are, it would choose the variation that seemed to have the most wins, the highest percentage of wins. This actually was a revolution within computer Go. And all of a sudden, the computers went to much weaker than me to significantly stronger than me. And it happened practically overnight. But still, even though they were stronger than me, they weren't near pro strength. And even today, using this approach, the strongest of these computers is 3 or 4 stones weaker than a strong professional. And what do I mean when I say that? I mean that the computer can play the first 3 or 4 moves on the board without the professional playing anything, and then maybe the game would be even. And that's a significant advantage, and we call it a handicap. And it's the equivalent of me starting a race with you, and I start at the 100-meter line, and you start at the 70-meter line, and we say go, and whoever finishes at the end wins. And I know that if I did that with Usain Bolt, I started at the 70 and he started at the 100, he'd win. But then again, he's a professional, right? So that's what you'd expect. But that's the kind of advantage we're talking about. So these Monte Carlo tree search computers got really, really good, but they weren't professional strength. And as of this January, people thought it would take approximately 10 years for computers to finally catch up to professionals. And that leads us to AlphaGo. And AlphaGo represents a major shift in what came before. So the Monte Carlo engines that we talked about were steadily improving, but it was incremental. And AlphaGo, which was invented by DeepMind, which is a business unit of Google, was done in a completely new way and represented a step change, right? A revolution rather than an evolution in terms of how computers play Go. And I'll try to explain it the best I understand it right now. And so AlphaGo still uses something like the Monte Carlo tree search that the other engines use, but instead of being programmed how to think in specific situations, it was allowed to learn for itself. So what basically happened is they uploaded 150,000 games of strong players from a popular Go server and showed these games in every individual move to AlphaGo. An image of every single move, some other parameters, and then as well who won the game. So it took all these images and it compiled them into its neural net, and it began to teach itself Go. And this is called deep learning, where it's not a human telling the computer how to think. Instead, it's the computer figuring it out for itself effectively. And it took these 150,000 games and something like 30 million moves, and it put them into two different sorts of engines. Now, one of these engines is called the value engine, and this is the ability to just look at a Go board and say, I think black is ahead and has a 60% chance of winning. And this is something that pros can do as well. Strong Go players can look at a board and say, oh yeah, I think black is ahead and is likely to win. But it's very intuitive on their part, and sometimes they'll say things like good shape or thickness or too many, he's too rich, he's got too many points, and they may be able to explain somewhat why, but they're not necessarily putting a probability on it, and it's not necessarily clear exactly why they think that way. But the value engine was an attempt to teach AlphaGo to make that assessment, and indeed it looks like it does it pretty well. It can just look at a board and say, yeah, I think from this point, black has a 60% chance of winning. And then they combine this with several policy networks. And policy networks are, I guess I would recommend you think of them as intuition. And actually, this is kind of what makes it really amazing. And it's the idea of what moves are likely to work. So being able to pick the moves that are likely to work. And it may look at a board position and say, all right, it's black's turn to play, and this move, just a particular move, looks like it's really likely to work. And this other move looks like it also might work. And so maybe there's 50% probability that the first move should be played, and a 20% move that the second move should be played, and a 20% move that a third move should be played, and a 5% for a fourth, and so on. It'll keep looking at all the moves, and it'll come to moves that, there's probably only a 1 in 10,000 chance that this move should be played. But nevertheless, it will go ahead and then take these moves and go through some Monte Carlo tree search and use more resources on the more likely moves. And then at the end of those Monte Carlo tree searches, it comes up with who won and who lost, and also applies its value engine of who it thinks it's leading, combines the two, and plays the move that it thinks is most likely to lead to a victory. Oh yeah, there's one other thing I wanted to mention, and that's, although AlphaGo was trained with these 150,000 games played by humans on a Go server, where it really showed its improvement is when it began to play itself. Not 150,000 times, but millions and millions of times, multiple lifetimes worth of effort if it was a human. And that's where it began to really show its strength. The amazing part of this is that it is mirroring human intuition, or it's akin to human intuition. So when humans play Go, it's one part reading, where if black plays here and white plays here and black plays here and white plays here and black plays here, okay, white's going to die. And so we picture the moves on the board. And that's something that computers can do okay, although it does it through that Monte Carlo tree search. So it does it differently than humans, but it can do it pretty well. But the other part that strong players have, and this is partially self-taught, having played many games, and then partially this multi-generational thing I was talking about, this institutional learning, where, and maybe I should even call it generational learning, where just as humanity, we've learned to play Go, that we've developed an intuition of which moves are likely to work, where we look first. But we probably don't go through nearly as many possibilities. Maybe we look at 3 likely moves or 5 likely moves, but we don't look at 100 likely moves, trying to figure out which ones are likely to work. So what AlphaGo has done is it's duplicated what we do for reading using Monte Carlo tree search, and what we do for intuition, it uses these engines, these policy networks and value network to help it find the next move. And that's pretty impressive. And the combination of these things has been a tremendous leap in the power of computer Go. Of course, none of us knew this was going on at all. And it wasn't until late January of this year, actually it was on my wedding day, when Google and DeepMind announced AlphaGo to the world. And they did it through Nature magazine and a bunch of press releases, and it was amazing. And it was amazing on, at least 2 levels. One of which is, when they announced it, they said, hey, guess what? This thing we're not supposed to be able to do for 10 years, which is beat a pro, we did it. And they had challenged the European champion, his name is Fan Hui, and to a match, and won 5 games to none. So they beat the European champion, who's a Chinese pro living in Europe. They beat him 5 games to none. And that was amazing. And they shared the games as well with the public and the Go community. And the second amazing thing that they did is they said, and Lee Sedol, who's one of the strongest players in the world, he's a Korean professional and holder of 18 international titles, and they said that Lee Sedol has agreed to play us in a 5-game series. We've challenged him, and he's accepted, and that's going to occur in March. And that was incredibly exciting. So, of course, the professional Go community looked at the 5 games that AlphaGo had played with Fan Hui and evaluated its performance. And the consensus was pretty universal. Number 1, yeah, this is impressive. This is better than any Go computer there's ever been, any program. And number 2, that it's good, but it isn't Lee Sedol good. Not even close. Because Lee Sedol is one of the grandmasters of Go. Fan Hui is a really good Go player, but he's ranked in the hundreds. And the difference between the two is noticeable. So no knock on Fan Hui, but people felt that his losing 5-0 didn't mean that Lee Sedol would lose. Oh, one more thing. Did I mention that the challenge included a prize of $1 million? So if Lee Sedol won, he would get $1 million prize from Google. And if AlphaGo won, Google committed to giving $1 million to charity, both Go-related and STEM course-related. It was a really big event from the Go community, from the AI community, and everyone was paying attention. Now, but those of us who said, oh yeah, AlphaGo doesn't stand a chance, it's going to get crushed, we didn't factor one thing in. And that is that the Lee Sedol games were going to occur 6 months after the Fan Hui games. And by continuing to play itself and improving, AlphaGo was able to get a lot stronger in that time. Of course, we didn't know. Anyway, to say that the Go world was abuzz for the few months between the announcement of AlphaGo and the games with Lee Sedol is a massive understatement. And when the games finally came around, I don't think Google had any idea how big a deal this was going to be. Not just from the Go community's perspective, not just from the AI community's perspective, but from the general public's perspective. It turned out to be a really big deal. And these games were live streamed on the internet, and I think in some of the Asian countries they were actually broadcast on TV. Like in Korea, it was on the regular channels there. They were live broadcasting these games. As a matter of fact, these games were Actually, live broadcast on the streets of Seoul. There were billboards up showing the game, and people would gather to watch as they were being played live. This was a really big deal, and it was so much fun to watch. All right, let's move on to the games.